Okay.
Awesome, awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining on this beautiful Thursday evening with us. I know it's a really nice warm weather outside. So out of everything, you took the opportunity to come here and join with us on this amazing LAN meetup this evening. So without any further delay, let me introduce you to our speaker of the month, James Snook. Hello, James. James is a bit, I'm going to give a little bit of introduction about James, and he's a freelance software process expert, and he has a lot of experiences. He comes from a development background. He's a developer. He is a product manager. He has been the Agile trainer and coach. He is wearing multiple hats. And before joining this session, I think James has given us this great topic, like Scrum is not enough, which is amazing. Like the title itself blew me out. Like, I need to know this. But so with his experiences, both in development and technical and product knowledge, so he's coming up with a lot of information and insights into why Scrum is not enough and how, especially the product governance, right? Governance will help expand the capabilities of Scrum. So all that insights we're gonna learn today. So without any further ado, I will give it to James, but I will also share James' LinkedIn profile. So if you want to get connected with James, please feel free to do so. And you can have questions anytime in the chat window, and we will give an opportunity for you to come up with questions in the middle. But we are very excited to have you here. All right. So without any further ado, James, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you very much. So welcome, everybody. Scrum is not enough. I think it comes across a little bit as anti-Scrum, but I just want to be clear, I'm not anti-Scrum. The process I'm going to talk about, product governance, Agile program management, is going to we're going to layer it on top of Scrum. Right? So Scrum is essential. It's just that we need more. Right? So just briefly, who am I and why am I worth listening to? So I am a computer engineer. I was actually the third year that U of T at University of Toronto graduated computer engineering. So when I went in, they hadn't graduated any classes of computer engineering yet. I'm that old. I was a developer for 10 years. I was a team lead, dev manager, director for the next 8. And I was a VP of engineering for about 5 years at 2 different companies, one of which was a Y Combinator startup called Canopy Labs, which did marketing analytics. And since 2019, I've been doing my own thing in the form of Agile management consulting. I have been teaching since 2019 a course on Agile software development at the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC. I was the director of product filling in for a vacancy at RubaCloud, and then that became something a little bit more permanent. And at RubaCloud, I've implemented the process that I'm about to describe to you. So it's not theoretical, it's something that I've really done in practice and seen work. And in 2021, I got switched over from product management to program management at Kinaxis. Kinaxis is a Canadian supply chain management software company which bought RubaCloud, so acquired it. And in 2022, I did a stint at a Canadian fintech, a small one called Commonwealth Retirement. So I do Agile program management, I do Scrum tune-ups, I do Agile training, and I fill in for gaps where I have the right skill set. I would say I have a major in engineering and a minor in product. So I do post on LinkedIn. I've made it a regular weekly thing. So if you're interested in topics around product management especially, but project management, DevOps, Agile, right, then feel free to connect with me. Follow me on LinkedIn. The link should be in the chat. I talk about anything from like how to manage a software product to how do we make DevOps work properly. I have had 1 million views on LinkedIn in the last year, more than that. So interesting statistic to achieve. Okay. So with that, enough about me. Before I start into the material, I do invite you, if you have questions, feel free to ask throughout. You don't necessarily have to keep your questions till the end, although I will also answer questions at the end. Like I said, I teach Agile software development at the Royal Bank, and I always encourage the students to go ahead and ask the questions. right, as they come up. Usually they're coming up at a particular time for a reason. There's a particular point on a slide that doesn't resonate or that seems too theoretical. So I invite you to ask the question as they enter your head. So a little bit about Scrum. I'm sure pretty much everyone here is already familiar with Scrum, but I want to point out a few of the key concepts, right, that we're going to then sort of expand into a bigger picture Agile program management. So in Scrum, we have a WIP limit, right? So how do we implement the WIP limit in Scrum? We have a sprint, and the sprint gets filled by the team. The team chooses how many stories can be done, right, in a single sprint. And what we have is then capped scope, right? Our sprint backlog is capped scope, right? We do not add to the sprint backlog once it's set. We try to deliver everything in the sprint backlog. We think we can deliver everything in the sprint backlog. That's why it was filled to that degree. But if we can't get one of our user stories done, then it just doesn't get done, right? Time doesn't stop for anyone. We hit the end of the sprint, and then we have to decide what to do with that user story, but it was not completed within the sprint, right? So related concept there is fixed time variable scope, right? You'll see this in many different Agile processes. It's an important concept, right? We're going to set some scope, and we're going to attempt to achieve that scope, but if it doesn't fit, time is fixed. When time ends, we are done. We're done building, right? So in the case of a sprint, right, we hit the end of the sprint after, say, industry standard 2 weeks. Whatever is not finished has to be reconsidered. Okay. So when is Scrum a good fit? Right, like I said, I'm not a hater of Scrum. I've done it for many, many years. Scrum is great for tactical execution, right? It's very good for one team executing on a product backlog. It's great when a team especially is exploring a solution space. So I've got an overall vision, but I've got various short-term strategies to try to find a solution, right, to a problem, and or I'm changing the problem every sprint. Scrum works well when a full user flow can be implemented within a single sprint. Right? Sometimes we do have epics that span multiple sprints, right, in Scrum, but Scrum works best when the user story does deliver a complete unit of functionality. Right? Scrum works well in a flat organization or tending towards flat. Right? Once we start to get into a very hierarchical organization, then you can end up with some problems around micromanagement, which we're going to talk about. And so related to that is Scrum works well with empowered product teams. Right? So if you've read the book Empowered by Marty Kagan, right, that's what we're talking about here. Right? When the teams are able to make choices, right, around how to solve a problem that, for example, is related to the organization's OKRs, right? And they're not being micromanaged in terms of exactly what they're doing, those empowered teams can execute well with a Scrum process. Okay. So when does Scrum break down? When is it not a great fit? Well, when I scale it without any kind of larger superstructure or process, it starts to become a little bit chaotic. If I have large complex features that span many sprints, right, and that's the primary sort of size of requirement that I'm delivering, Scrum starts to become problematic in that it's difficult to track exactly where we are when we're just looking at user stories. And when I have a bunch of complex features that are broken down to user stories, put into a backlog, they can become intertwined at the sort of strategic level. Sure, I can do my best to keep the user stories independent from each other, but there is a larger strategic deliverable in form of that feature that's made up of multiple user stories that then get kind of mixed up, right, when they're all part of a single backlog. If I'm implementing a complex strategy and I'm trying to keep many stakeholders happy, right, and I'm just one team especially, Scrum is problematic. In one single sprint, I can probably only keep 1 or 2 stakeholders happy, right? Whereas I might be trying to keep 5, 6, 7 stakeholders happy. They might represent different departments in the organization. Customer support may have different priorities than marketing, than sales, right? Than your development team itself, who's trying to reduce technical debt. Right? So if I'm going to try to come up with a balanced plan, right, that keeps the entire organization humming and happy, I need to think in terms of a time frame longer than 2 weeks. Right? And Scrum can sometimes be problematic in an organization that has command and control management. Right? And rather than lament that and say that organizations should be flatter, right, or more democratic, we just have to accept that that's the way a lot of organizations run. Right? So let's talk about Agile program management. Right?
James, can you
Yep.
explain what a command and control means?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Command and control tends to be a more hierarchical organization, not flat. Right. So you've got managers with managers all the way up to executives in the C level, and the marching orders tend to come down from on top. The strategy tends to be set very firmly, directly, and explicitly up at the top level, and it sort of rolls down. Right? In this kind of an environment, in this kind of an organization, the teams tend not to be empowered because that's sort of off-putting, right, to the senior levels, because they don't feel they have proper control anymore. Right? So if you've got this sort of command and control structure, and it's not just like, if you're thinking it's government, it's not just government, right? You know, if you think of even a large organization like IBM, I've worked at IBM twice. You know, there are like 7 to 9 levels, right, of management, because it's a big company, right? And you tend to have strategy set at the top and have it roll down, you know, with a very fixed set of expectations, right? That's sort of like the opposite of empowered teams. And that's when Scrum starts to become a little bit problematic. Why? Because someone from 2 or 3 levels up, right, might come and ask a team, they come and ask a Scrum Master, well, what's your velocity? Is it going up or down? How'd you do last sprint? Did you get all your user stories done? This is micromanagement, right? This is interfering in tactics, right? What you're going to see is what we're going to try to go after here with Agile program management, or a proper approach to product governance, is we're going to try to tease apart strategy from tactics. It is the responsibility of senior management. It is the responsibility of the C-level to implement strategy, to define and make sure strategy is happening. But it's not the responsibility of senior management to go and ask, you know, why did you only get 4 user stories done out of 5 in your last sprint? That is micromanagement. And it also usually has the opposite effect of what the senior manager intended, right? If the team feels scared, right, or chastised for not delivering all of their user stories, what do you think they're going to do next sprint? They're probably going to plan less, right? Which is a form of sandbagging, right? So it's going to actually have a negative impact, and the opposite of one of what that senior manager expected, right? So that's the danger, right, of having sort of just Scrum with nothing above it, you know, exposed to the senior management layers. Does that make sense a bit?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm just wondering, is there any example of a large company that doesn't do that? Because you just described every large company.
It's a good question. So the example that comes to mind, the counterexample, I guess, that comes to mind is probably Amazon. I'm sure that, you know, Amazon has these instances of senior managers micromanaging as well from time to time, but Amazon has also been described as the world's largest collection of startups. The teams are generally pretty independent from each other, right? When in 2006, Amazon embarked on its journey, you know, to become a microservice-based architecture, they also created that 2-pizza team for each of the main services, and they let each of those teams, as long as they stayed within the bounds of their API, right, and as long as they implemented useful features that the customers wanted, they gave them a lot of latitude, and they may have been given direction in the form of, well, you know, this new team, your goal is to get more customers. Don't worry so much about profitability. This team that's been around for a long time, your product's been around for a while. Let's try to tighten up the infrastructure and get more profitability. This team over here, you're in the middle of growing. Let's try to get more revenue. You can give each of these teams a direction, and then it's up to them to figure out, you know, from a product management perspective, what to build, and from a project management perspective, what order to build it in. Right? So you get a lot more flexibility and freedom. You get a lot more empowered teams in that kind of an organization. Does that make sense?
It does. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. So let's talk about, what do I mean, right, when I say Agile program management, right? In other words, product governance. Okay. So we're going to start with Scrum. All right. Scrum is great, but Scrum is technical, right? We're going to put a strategic layer on top of Scrum. So we're going to add some concepts that don't really properly exist in Scrum, like releases, right? So we're going to apply some of the same principles I described earlier that make Scrum work. We're just going to apply them at a larger scale in terms of requirements scope, and a larger scale potentially in terms of number of teams involved as well. So WIP limit, right? So we're going to have a WIP limit of one initiative in progress per team. And I'm going to talk about what an initiative is in the next slide. But think of it as a large unit of scope. We want to get these major features out for customers as soon as possible. We do that by not parallelizing, multiple initiatives for a single team. The team focuses on one initiative, gets it done, gets it out the door, and then moves on to another one. That's how we deliver customer value as quickly as possible. Right? We want capped scope. Same idea as when I hit the end of my sprint, right? I set it with a certain amount of scope. I set it with a certain number of user stories, right? And I'm not allowed to add user stories to a sprint backlog in Scrum. Right? That's an important aspect of Scrum. Similarly, if we're going to do Agile program management, I don't want executives coming and adding entire initiatives, right, to the release plan. And that's the same, right? That's tantamount to adding stories, right, to my sprint in Scrum. You're breaking the the whole concept of a capped scope, right? And it's not just me, right, as like the program manager, right, or as a director of product saying no. What you're going to see is that when we came up with this agreement, it was agreed upon by all the stakeholders, right? So if you try to, jam another initiative in and you put one of the previously accepted initiatives at risk, then it becomes Clash of the Titans. It's not just me that you're pushing around, you're trying to push around all of your fellow stakeholders, right? So it becomes politically more difficult, and therefore we're politically more able to say no, right, when a senior stakeholder comes in and tries to jam a new initiative into the plan. That doesn't mean we're completely rigid, though. Right. So what you're going to see is when we talk about, I'm going to talk about iterative requirements elaboration. When I expand the scope of, and when I expand the definition, and I add details to my initiative, and I add my epics underneath, and then underneath my epics, I'm going to eventually add in user stories. Well, I may be making the product a little bit bigger than I thought it would be in terms of its definition, and that's okay. That includes if a senior manager comes in and says, well, I know you guys have already expanded the initiative into epics and the epics to user stories. I just thought of something important, right? I think I have one more user story we need. If the product manager agrees, then that's okay, right? It's a very small thing, right? Not the same thing as jamming an entire new initiative into the scope for the release. If you add an initiative, you're changing the strategy. If I add a user story underneath an existing initiative, I'm just adding a detail. I'm not changing the strategy. Okay. So related to the notion of capped scope is, again, fixed time variable scope. Remember, that's implemented in Scrum, right, in the form of our sprints. We're going to have a release. The release is going to have a time frame, and we're going to ship as many initiatives as possible, just as we try to ship as many user stories as possible in a sprint. We are going to ship as many initiatives as we can within the release time frame, but we're going to stick to that release time frame, right? And when the time is up, we are done. If I only ship 6 out of 8 planned initiatives, well, that's what I shipped, right? And just like with the single sprint in Scrum, I can reconsider, right? I could potentially add those user stories if I want to in the next sprint. I could potentially add those other 2 initiatives that didn't fit into the next release, because this is an ongoing process. And the releases, which are generally quarterly, right? Financial quarters, 3 months or so, but you could do 6 weeks if you want to. Right? These quarterly releases run into each other. It's the same way sprints rub up against each other. Right? What you're going to find, though, when you do this in practice is that, okay, I didn't get those 2 out of 8 initiatives done. Do I likely want them in the next release? Oftentimes you don't, right? Oftentimes you found out new information, or you want to pivot and change direction, right? So they are there. They're defined quite well. They're broken down into epics. And so you can, if you want to, use them in the next release. But we now have a basis of saying no, right? When a senior manager comes up and tries to add scope, okay? Whereas under Scrum, if a senior manager comes in and says, I want a few more user stories, if you try to say no and you don't have any of this superstructure, they might say, well, okay, fine, I won't add it to the current sprint because I respect the Scrum process, but I want you to put it into the backlog, into the product backlog. That's going to be a very difficult conversation because I don't really have a good process reason for saying no to that, right? And if you say yes, and you're kind of like, like laughing a little bit, you put it at the bottom of the backlog, then that's just a form of lying, right? And you'll lose the trust of senior management very quickly, right? So we don't have good answers, right, for fending off additional scope additions, right? Call it scope creep if you want, right, from senior managers under Scrum alone. Okay. Let's talk about an initiative. What is an initiative? What do I mean when I say initiative? So there is no truly standard term for this, right, in the Agile world. I take the term initiative, the Jira portfolio product called these initiatives, what is an initiative? It's a strategic high-level deliverable, right? And in terms of the requirements hierarchy, initiatives are made up of epics, and epics are then made up of user stories. So it's one level higher than epics. It's quite large, right? It's strategic, right? It must solve a customer problem. That's why we're doing it. Right? We should identify which customer problem we're solving here, right? We're going to initially define it as a 1 or 2 page feature brief. And I'm not going to go into details, but if you look up like Kevin Steigerwald feature brief, he has a good format for feature briefs. There's like 5 main items you want to include in your feature brief to describe this idea, this initiative, and why should I do it now, and what am I adding on top of it, the product already, that sort of thing. We are going to expand each of these initiatives into a set of epics, maybe 3 to 5 epics in an initiative, right? And eventually, those epics will then be expanded into user stories. But we're not going to do it right away, right? Because we want to be efficient. We don't want to create a whole bunch of inventory we do end up using. And from a lean perspective, we don't want to create waste. Okay. Now, and this other point, this last point here is very key, right? Whereas under Scrum, we endeavor to keep our user stories independent of each other. We oftentimes can't do that, especially in the small. Right? We have user stories that are often dependent on each other. When it comes to those top level initiatives, it is critical that the initiatives be independent of each other. And you're going to see why as we move forward, because we need to be able to cut initiatives when we run out of time. We need to be able to deprioritize initiatives, right? If our idea of their priority changes, right? I don't want cutting an initiative to be any more fraught than it's already going to be. I need cutting an initiative to be clean from a technical perspective, and clean from a political perspective as much as we can get it, right? I don't want to have to worry about, well, if I cut initiative number 4, it's going to affect number 5, right? Like that's really problematic, right? If I need to cut 4, I should be able to just cut 4 and not worry about any other impacts. It's already going to probably be a potentially difficult political decision, right, to do any of these large scope cuts at all, right? So we need those initiatives to be independent of each other, right? The analogy I like to use here is your initiatives are kind of like your compartments in the hull of a ship, right? So ships are compartmentalized, modern ships. If you hit an iceberg, you should probably only lose 1 compartment, maybe 2. If you've got 10 compartments and you lose 2 of them, your ship will not sink, right? You're still held up by the other 8. Same idea here, right? I want to ship as many initiatives as possible so that the strategy still makes sense, right? It still holds water. Okay. So let's talk about the release plan. Right. Well, on an ongoing basis, we're going to be gathering ideas. What do I mean by that? Well, if a senior manager comes up to you and says, I've got this great new idea. It's a major initiative, right? And I'll be, okay, that's great. Can I please have it as a feature brief? Can you write up a 1 or 2 page feature brief for me, right? You could tell me about it right now. Happy to hear about it. And I'm going to ask you, since it's your idea, to start me off with a feature brief, right? And then I'm going to say, that's fantastic, and we are not going to do it right now. We're going to put it in the list, and then as we plan our release for the next quarter, I am going to look at it. I promise. I will give it a fair shake, right? But I'm not going to do it now because you would derail my release right now. So write it down, give it to me, and we'll think about it for the next release. And that's an ongoing process. I'm not tricking anyone. I'm not lying, right? I really will think about it, right? In the case where I'm being asked for something that really doesn't make sense and fit with the product, doesn't fit with the product vision, I will say so. No, we shouldn't build our own NLP chatbot because I can just buy that off the shelf somewhere. Where did you want the chatbot again? Let's talk about whether I can buy it from a third party. Right? Okay, and then once I've gotten a whole bunch of ideas to work with, as I plan concretely for the next quarter, I'm doing this in advance of the quarter. For example, say 9 weeks out, I'm going to prioritize initiatives. I may have like 40, but I've only got 5 teams. I could probably only get 10 done, right? So I got a lot of ideas, which is good, right? Because I have a lot of options, right? Optionality is good, right? But I got to prioritize that to a small list. What's going to guide me? Well, the quarterly OKRs. And if you have annual OKRs for your company, then that should guide you as well. And if your company is not doing OKRs, then you should at least have a product vision, right? What is this product all about? We should know why we're building this product and who we're building it for. Okay. We are then going to have, I'm going to have to ask the engineering team for rough estimates for the most important initiatives, because I'm going to need to try to do a little bit of Tetris and make this fit, right, in a quarter. I'm not going to start out a quarter with a plan that I know is not going to fit, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? So in a quarter, you have 6.5 sprints, round that down to 6, right? When I ask for an estimate from the engineering team, I'm going to ask for it in team sprints. And I'm going to ask a specific engineering team, whichever team is most appropriate. Here's a feature brief, read it over, ask me some questions, tell me in the number of team sprints, how long you think it would take your team to build this. And they can answer any number they want. But if the answer is more than 6, then I have a job to do. I have to go back and I have to split that initiative into 2 smaller parts. Okay, because that's not going to fit in a sprint, in a single release, right? In a single quarter. In total, right, I'm going to have scope that fits, right, all the team's capacity for 1 financial quarter. Then I'm going to have and when I'm putting this together, in addition to being guided by the OKRs, I'm going to also be trying to balance out multiple concerns. Right? So I'm going to probably be getting ideas for initiatives from the customer support team, from the marketing team, from the sales team, from engineering who's trying to reduce technical debt, from a solution architecture team who's implementing for customers. I'm going to try to make everybody satisfied while keeping the product sensible, right? So I have that to consider as well in terms of stakeholder input, as well as the OKRs for the company. Right? And at the end, right, after I propose that plan, there may be a little bit of horse trading, a little bit of back and forth. After I propose that plan, I need a formal agreement, right? I need a formal handshake. I'm not going to make anybody sign anything, but I am going to take that PowerPoint, because I ultimately am going to produce a PowerPoint that describes what we're doing with a list of all the initiatives, a page for each one, a sort of boiled down version of my feature brief for each one. And I'm going to say, okay, this plan's accepted and that's what we're doing, right? And I'm going to resend it to everybody. Okay. So, and if anybody still objects, they shouldn't, because I'm not going to do that until we all say and nod in the meeting that, yes, this is what we want to do. They can say so right away, right? But they can't say so later, right? Because now I'm moving forward, right, with this plan. Okay. So I mentioned initiatives, right? My plan, right, is based on initiatives. I haven't done epics yet. Okay, why? Because I had like 40 initiatives to think about, and I'm not going to break all of them down into epics. That's called creating inventory, right? From a lean perspective, right? That is creating potentially waste. I'm not going to even implement all of these initiatives. So why would I do that, right? Once I get agreement on the plan, then now it's the time, to enlist your individual product managers for each of the teams to break down each of those initiatives into epics. Right? The epics may span more than 1 sprint. Obviously, they can't span more than 6 because it'll break us out of the quarter, right? But they shouldn't, right? Because our initiatives fit. So why would our epics be bigger, right? And then we're going to do one more sanity check to make sure that overall, once I've got all my initiatives for the quarterly plan broken down to epics, that we still think that with this definition, it'll still fit. If it doesn't, then let's cut some initiative before we even start implementing, right? That's the easiest time to cut something, when there are no sunk costs. Sunk costs is a fallacy, right? It's a cognitive bias. It's not helpful, but it's real, right? Try telling a senior executive that you're going to cut their half-finished feature. They're not going to be happy about that, right? But if you say, I'm going to cut this feature, don't worry, we haven't started it yet, we can think about it for the next quarter, that's a lot easier, right, in terms of a conversation. Right? Before I start to build an initiative, and only before I start to build an initiative, am I going to do another level of requirements elaboration. Only then am I going to break those epics into user stories, individual user stories, right, that each fit within a sprint. Right? I'm not going to do that in advance because I may not end up implementing an initiative, even if I think with a potentially optimistic viewpoint that I'm going to get this other initiative done for this team. You guys are going to work on these 2 initiatives. Why don't we break them both down right now? I'm going to say, please don't do that, right? Because there are surprises that can happen during the first initiative they're working on. They can expand to be bigger than they expect. They can be hit by production defects they get distracted by. They can have to deal with a common security vulnerability, right, in one of their libraries. One of their developers can quit. Bad things can happen, right? And then they end up taking more time to get the first initiative done. And what I don't want to do is start initiatives in the middle of or towards the end of a release and not finish them, I would rather choose a lower priority, smaller initiative than get into a higher priority initiative and not finish it. Right? Think of it the same way you would manage a sprint, right, in Scrum. Right? I'm going to try to maximize the number of user stories that are finished, done, delivered, deployed. Right? That's what we're after. Right? Big picture here, right, in the release. Okay. So the benefits of iterative requirements elaboration is reduced inventory and less waste. Okay. What happens when I start building? Okay. So I've expanded my epics for the initiatives that are in progress into full user stories. I'm going to start using Scrum. Okay. When I'm tracking, when I talk to the senior executives, the senior stakeholders, right, I want a nice, simple, clean, high-level status. I don't want to talk about, you know, the 26 epics we have and the 78 user stories, because that's just going to drown them in details and confuse them, right? I want to talk about the initiatives. Okay, guys, I have 4 initiatives in progress. They're going well. I'm going to fit them in this quarter, right? According to velocity, according to the engineers. And I have 6 after that. And the first 4, numbers 5 to 8, look like they're still going to be in scope. The number 9 is looking like it's at risk, right? And number 10, I'm going to tell you right now that I'm going to have to take this out of scope because it's not going to fit based on the team that's going to work on it based on their velocity. Okay. So I can see this. I talk in terms of initiatives, and I don't get too far into the weeds with these senior stakeholders. If they're really involved and really knowledgeable, I might go down to the epic level, but I don't go down beyond that, and I don't go down to the user story level with them because that's not useful. Then I'm blurring the line again between strategy and tactics. Right? So I report at the initiative level. Right? When I'm executing, I've got each team working on one initiative at a time because I want to deliver it, right, with maximum probability, right, at the end of this release. And I don't want to start an initiative if I don't think I can finish it. Okay? Course correction is trivial, right? At least technically speaking. I calculate my velocity, I use estimates, I see that an initiative won't fit, I'm going to cut it from scope. Politically, your mileage may vary, but I do want to say that when I did this with RuberCloud, they were actually very good, right? Surprisingly good about being rational and reasonable. I was saying, like, I'm not trying to cut scope for the sake of cutting scope. I'm cutting scope because it is not going to fit, right? And I'm giving you the information ahead of time. I'm not going to surprise you in the last sprint and go, by the way, I'm not going to ship 5 out of 10 of your initiatives, right? We're going to reevaluate every 2 weeks if we have a 2-week sprint, right? And I'm going to tell you every 2 weeks what now doesn't fit. Usually it'll be probably 1 initiative at a time. So our plan will slowly degrade, and the organization should have time to digest that, right? It's the big surprises that can really jar an organization that cause damage, right? So we're going to do this a bit at a time with good reasoning. Under the covers, it's still Scrum. At the tactical level, it's still Scrum, right? From week to week execution, right? You're still implementing user stories in the end. It's just that they happen to ladder up to epics and they ladder up ultimately to initiatives. We should still be deploying code every sprint. Or, right, if you've read Accelerate and you're a fan of the DORA metrics, I like them. Deploy even faster if you have a good deployment pipeline, right? Just because we're thinking in terms of the release strategically doesn't mean we're not operating with tactical excellence. We should still be using Scrum underneath. We should still be shipping every 2 weeks, and or faster if we can. Good question?
Yeah. So the question is, don't you lose credibility if your plan basically starts degrading? You've got one you can't ship. You've got 2 weeks later, crap, can't do another thing. I mean,
Yeah.
Don't you eventually lose credibility? Talk through that.
Yeah, sure. Well, the thing is, when it comes to we've hopefully been moving away from waterfall for like 20 years now, right? Fixed time, fixed scope, fixed cost is an illusion, right? And I'm old. I've done waterfall projects before, right? If they've ever been achieved, right, it involves buffering, right? Because life tends to throw curveballs, right? So if the organization, right, is used to waterfall plans that are being achieved, I can assure you there's a lot of buffering under the covers, and there's probably a lot of inefficiency there, right? We do have to enter a situation where the organization is comfortable with this level of transparency, right? I am a very honest person. I don't like hiding things, right? So I prefer to say, right, if I know at this point that I'm not going to be able to get one of my 10 initiatives done, I just want to say it now, right? And because it's helpful for adjusting course, right? We can have a discussion about, well, you don't want to cut number 10, you'd rather cut number 9. Yeah, if they're about the same size, that's fine. We can talk about that. That's fine. That's a strategic discussion, right? The way to avoid having like a lot of disappointment, right, is by having realistic, good estimates, right, from the engineering team, right? The amount of disappointment, right, by senior management is going to be proportional to the inaccuracy of the estimates from the engineering team, right? So we do need the engineering team to be realistic, and I'm going to say at the initiative level and the epic level, even a little bit pessimistic about how long something's going to take, right? And then probably that will end up being a more accurate, realistic estimate, right? I think that, you know, it also goes to the saying, right? Like if you aim for the sun and you hit the moon, right, then that's probably a pretty good result. So it's okay to be ambitious, right? But we also have to be kind of, you know, accepting and realistic about our feet of clay, right? So upper management has to understand that. I mean, the counter, right? Let's consider the alternative, right? Well, if we don't want to cut any scope, then, well, one of two things is going to happen, right? One is that we're going to hit our end date, and then I'm going to, like, surprise, we're only half done, right? And that's going to be a huge shock to the system, right? And very hard to adjust to, and it can be very damaging, right, for a private business, right? Or I'm going to be saying, like, I need more time, right? And there are a couple of known project management dysfunctions that go along with not sticking to fixed time, right? One is called the death march, right? And the death march is like a project that goes on for a very long time, potentially more than 1 or 2 years, right? And you start to kind of lose the vision. Why was I building this again in the first place? And you know, you keep holding off, and your releases are very few and far between. And it's just it's a really bad scene, and it can in private industry can cause bankruptcy, right? Another variant of that is something called the large batch death spiral. The large batch death spiral is, okay, I can't get the original scope done. Hey, senior stakeholders, can you give me a bit more time? And they'll say, okay, I'll give you more time, but I'm also going to give you some more scope. And then we misestimate the scope again. And so we get to the next date, and we still haven't done everything, including the new scope, right? And so our batch gets bigger, and the risk gets bigger, and we don't want to release this half-finished thing, and we do it again and again. And we end in this large batch death spiral where we're building up risk, right? With every extension. It's better to just be honest with yourself and with the organization and say that, you know, I hit the end of my fixed time and I only got 5 out of 8 of my initiatives done. We're going to estimate better in the next quarter, right? I think it's an important lesson here, which is, like, failure is an option. If you try to avoid failure, you can make things even worse, right? You failed, right? If you didn't get it done on time, it doesn't matter, right, whether we extend the time or not. We didn't get the scope done in the time that we hoped for. It's better to just have a endpoint where we release what we've got. Each of my initiatives was independent. I am helping the customer. I am providing value, right? And then we'll plan a little bit better in the next release. Does it help a little bit?
It does. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So just to reiterate that last point before I move to the next slide, yes, we are still using Scrum. Scrum is there under the covers, right? It is our week-to-week execution. It is our tactical execution approach, right? Continue to deploy code, right? Every sprint, right? And that includes, even if I've not finished the initiative, right? I can send out finished user stories. I can deploy completed epics, and each of those may or may not be suitable to make visible at that time, and you can control that with a feature flag. Okay, but don't defer uncertainty. Ship regularly. Some notes on stakeholder management right under this approach. Okay, senior managers are responsible for the strategy. Where did the OKRs come from? They came from senior management, right? They're guiding us. They guided us to the plan, right? They guide us to the initiatives that we're going to be implementing with. But senior managers are not responsible for tactics. That does have to be left to the team. The teams must be empowered at least to that point, right? Where they're allowed to make appropriate sprint plans, including ambitious sprint backlogs that they don't always hit without being chastised. Right? We don't want to add initiatives to the release plan. We want capped scope in terms of the release plan and the initiatives that are in it. It's okay if we need to like just tweak things a little bit by adding 1 or 2 user stories, maybe even an epic, but we don't want to add entire initiatives because that means we are no longer adhering to the strategy that we had all agreed to, right, in our consensus plan. We want to track the release using initiatives. They're nice big blocks, right, that are very understandable, associated with a particular customer problem, and we know why we're doing it, right? And we have only 8 or 10 to keep track of for a group of 4 or 5 Scrum teams. Right? And then we're going to cut at the initiative level. I'm not going to like do open heart surgery on the initiative, open it up, which user stories should I take out? That's really a bit too much detail, right? Especially in front of the stakeholders. Let's just treat the initiatives as atomic blocks that we keep or that we cut. If you want to get into an advanced implementation of this, you might look at the epics. You could say, could I cut one of my epics and reduce the size of the initiative and still get it out? But that's a little bit advanced. You can do this in a simple fashion by just treating initiatives as atomic blocks that cannot be further broken down, at least from a scope management perspective. Right? And again, fixed time variable scope. We are going to ship as many initiatives as we can. That is our goal. And that's how we're going to continue to operate, right? And we're going to try to avoid starting an initiative unless we can finish it, right? So it's better to start a small, lower priority initiative and finish it and ship it than to start a larger, higher priority initiative and not ship it. Always favor shipping. Okay. So it's dangerous to go alone. Take this. So anybody who's familiar with Link and the Legend of Zelda, at scale, right? Scrum alone lacks broader strategy, right? You can get lost in the trees, right? When I have a big project with complicated initiatives made up of many user stories intertwined and tangled, right? It doesn't give us an easy way of tracking. I don't want to just look at a giant backlog with like 87 user stories in it. I want to think in terms of strategy. I want to think in terms of initiatives, right? And we need that initiative interface so that senior management can weigh in and first of all, tell us about what the OKRs are, tell us about what initiatives are useful and why, which customer problems are most important and why, and that they can help us make a decision about when it comes time to cut scope, which of the several options should we cut, which is most appropriate at this time based on the current knowledge we have. So you should add Agile program management to your inventory. Okay. The benefits. Strategy is separate from tactics, right? This prevents micromanagement by senior stakeholders. Fixed time and variable but capped release scope. This way we get a predictable end date. Exactly what's in it is going to be unclear in the sense of we probably won't get everything we hope for, but it will be a subset. We have the ideal full set. We may not get all of that set, but it will be obviously from initiatives in that set, right? We have regular pivot points, right? As we plan for each release, for example, every 3 months, those are our pivot points. They exist, they're always there, right? And they're always where we're going to put our new ideas, right, to be considered as we plan for the next release. This reduces the pressure on a senior stakeholder to come in and try to jam more scope into a given sprint. Right? Our status, right, our status reporting becomes easy, simple, understandable, comprehensible. Right? We're talking about initiatives. There are only 10 of them. Right? And so we're going to talk about the status of each of them, and it's very digestible. Right? And on a related note, course correction is easy. I'm going to pick one of those initiatives, right? And I'm going to not ship it. Right? Every 2 weeks, right? We can optionally cut an item, right? We can optionally cut one of our initiatives, right? That prevents a big surprise at the end when a whole bunch of initiatives turn out not to be finished or shippable. Right? This approach presents, right, an optimal implementation of strategy. our plan is balanced, right, across the needs of many stakeholders. We're going to maximize the number of initiatives that get shipped to production. And we're going to minimize the amount of inventory and waste that we create via our iterative requirements elaboration. So thank you for your time. I appreciate that. If you want more like this, you can follow me on LinkedIn. And I do Agile management consulting in the form of Agile program management implementations, Scrum tune-ups, and I do Agile training as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, James, for an amazing presentation. We all thoroughly enjoyed it. Now we'll open the floor for questions. I do see one question in the chat. So the question is from Karen. What example can you share of an initiative that someone tried to add to a release plan?
Okay, so in one of the, okay, so an example of initiative someone tried to jam in. What I ended up doing in that case, it did actually, okay, so I was new on the job. So I ended up horse trading, right, rather than allowing it to be jammed in. We had a bunch of work related to putting together a machine learning platform. And what was asked for was an optimization of cost. Okay, so we were using a bunch of Amazon Web Services, right, under the covers, and not that efficiently. So what ended up happening was we had a sort of semi-urgent request after we had put the plan together to reduce cost, right? We need to stop burning cash. So I can kind of understand where that came from. So what we ended up doing was taking out one of our initiatives related to the implementation of a larger machine learning platform. And we ended up putting in an item to go ahead, investigate, tease apart the cost of running this system in production, and then reduce, right, the cost by reducing, like unnecessary compute instances that we didn't really need to achieve the level of performance that was acceptable to our customers. So we swapped out a subpart of a larger platform and we put in a cost reduction initiative. Does that make sense?
Any other questions we have for James? I see another question. So organizations like Amazon, Meta, Google don't use Scrum, as far as I have heard. What is their go-to approach? Do you feel they'll apply Scrum in the future?
Do I feel that they will apply the Scrum in the future? Mm-hmm. I think that, so a lot of these organizations, they don't mandate any particular approach, right? So they let the team choose the Agile approach that they want. And a lot of times it's just more of a apply Agile principles. So for example, right, some of the principles, right, that are behind Scrum can also be applied in a somewhat more abstract fashion, right, where it's like just stay lean, right, and do something that's Kanban-like, right? So we don't want too much work in progress, right? And you can choose at what level that applies, right? Because it's distracting, right, and because it ends up actually sort of reducing, right, the frequency of our ability to ship, right? There's a big focus on getting automated pipelines out, right? And once we've got automated pipelines out, I can look at stuff like DORA metrics, and I can optimize the frequency at which I send code to production, and I can work on more of a, I mean, it's basically is a, an iterating plan basis like Scrum, right? Even if they don't call it Scrum, but I've got to have like some instance, right, where I define work, break it down, right, and work with the teams to deliver. If you read any of the Marty Kagan books, one of the principles that I think is applied here is the product trio. So product manager, a designer, and a tech lead, and then a few more developers as well, without any sort of like hard framework on top. And the team is empowered, right? And the team is given freedom to deliver. Now, they should still be, if you read like the Christina Watke book about OKRs, right? we're still trying to adhere to some company strategy, right? So I would say that, especially in Google, right, OKRs are a big thing, right? I end up with quarterly OKRs, and then the teams are expected to set their own OKRs that align with the company strategy, right? And we use metrics, right, to see whether we actually met our goals as much as possible, right, towards the end. Another related set of, I guess, plans, right, sort of set of process that comes along with modern product management and delivery is customer discovery. So customer discovery is like Teresa Torres is the expert on that. Customer discovery is how do I figure out what to build, right? And that's done primarily with your product manager, but the product manager should be bringing the designer along to meet with the customer and should ideally bring someone from engineering along to these regular meetings with the various customers to figure out whether we're building the right thing, right? And to understand the customer's pain and understand the customer's problems. So these are all sort of like general principles that are applied that are sort of broader, right? And or loosely related to some of the same ideas that underlie Scrum, right? But it's a very fluid thing, right? It is strategic because it's linked to the company's OKRs. And I mean, if the organization, right, if the sub part of the organization is not delivering, well, then there's going to be, I guess, questions asked, right, as to, well, what did you try? Why didn't it work? Same kind of questions that you're going to have to talk about if you use a Scrum or another approach related to Scrum. So that's a little bit of a broad and somewhat rambling answer, but maybe that helps a little bit.
Thank you. So we have another question from Dan. Do you incorporate PI planning within the APM structure?
Do we implement, do you say pair planning?
PI planning.
PI
Program
planning,
increment planning or product.
Within the Agile program management structure?
Mhm.
That's, so that's a safe thing, right? So it's a good question, right? So safe is another way of doing Agile program management, and it's got a whole bunch of terms, right? And a whole bunch of concepts associated with it. Full disclosure, I've never run a safe project. I've run many Scrum projects and Scrum at scale, but not officially safe. So based on my high level understanding, right, of the notion of a PI it's going to be similar to the release plan at the quarterly level, right? So it's the big picture of what I want to deliver, right? Under safe, we'd probably call it PI planning, right? Whether it's 6 weeks or a quarter, it's up to you, right? But the whole idea is you've got this kind of strategic release of a non-trivial size, right? And you got to make sure that it's coherent, right, from a content perspective. In other words, program management. And you got to make sure you deliver as much of it as you can, and that's the project management aspect of it. So I would say, PI and sort of the quarterly plan are the release plan are pretty much the same thing. Does that answer the question?
So I'm assuming yes. I have another question from Dan. Have you had teams use Kanban in this APM structure?
I haven't. So, what do I think about whether that would work? Okay, my personal view, and this is going to be a more general answer. My personal view is that Kanban is best suited for very dynamic situations where, right, because we don't have, you're required to do a lot of planning, right, under Kanban. It's like you've got a bunch of items in a backlog, and you're just taking, right, the most important ones. It's very good for like customer support, very good for a highly exploratory process. But when you're doing something like this, when you're doing like Agile program management, that's in a big command and control organization where you're trying to implement as much as possible from a very, kind of rigid plan, right? And so having a structure like, whether you do it with 1 week or 2 weeks Scrum is a little bit better. You do know what the big picture is. You're not exploring, you're not reacting so much, right, to to new requests that come in. You shouldn't be. We're trying to minimize that, right? We're trying to stick to a plan, right, for a quarter. Whereas Kanban is better for that kind of that ability to react, right? Somewhere in between Scrum and Kanban, you could do Scrumban. I think Scrumban under an Agile program management approach would be reasonable. It's still got it's pull based like Kanban, right? But it's got a little bit better of a notion of velocity, so I can have a little bit more predictability in terms of when I'm going to be done. So I would say Kanban, I don't know if I would be personally comfortable with it. I think that's a little bit of a more reactive process, more dynamic process. This is a bit more of a planned process. So I think something like Scrum underneath, or possibly Scrumban is appropriate.
I have another question in the chat. In an organization that has other people that do not use this type of program management, can you speak about introducing it to an organization and how to stay strong against the different culture?
Now, I guess the question, so there's two angles we can come in at, right, in terms of Agile program management. We can come in from the perspective of the organization is extremely loose, right, and maybe doing Scrum, may not even be doing Scrum, right, but they're looking to, I don't like to come in and impose this unless there's an interest, right? Like that's just a uphill political battle that I don't want to fight, right? So if there is interest, then there's probably something going wrong, okay? So either the place is too chaotic, right? And so we need to put a little bit more structure in place. We need to go from Scrum to Agile program management, or the organization is coming from waterfall and it hasn't been working. The sort of fixed time, fixed scope, fixed cost projects have not been turning out well, and they want to try something a little bit more flexible. So I would suggest that understand where you're coming from, so you can explain how this process is different, right? When I did it at RubaCloud, they were coming in from the chaotic situation, right? They were a startup. They had grown to a size of about 100. They were overpacking their quarterly plans. They did have an overall they had like 4 strategic pillars from the CTO, and they had quarterly goals, right? So this fit in pretty nicely, right, into a process where they were thinking, or at least I could encourage them to think more in terms of quarterly deliverables. It's pretty natural for an organization once you get to a certain size, but they were eager, right, to have a little bit more structure, a little bit more predictability in the process, and they were happy with this process when we put it in place. I would imagine the opposite could also be true, right? If you're coming from a traditional waterfall background, what this is going to provide then is a lot more transparency. You're not going to be surprised at the end, right? When a whole bunch of features are not done. The date is predictable. Exactly what's in the release is not entirely predictable, but it is going to be from a set, right, of initiatives that we all agreed to. So I'm going to call it semi-predictable. The date is fully predictable. The scope is semi-predictable, right? And I just being able to ship regularly, right, at a minimum every quarter, but really much faster than that, it would be a lot better. And if we actually get useful large features out the door every quarter for an organization that is doing a traditional waterfall project, that's an improvement, right? Does that help a bit?
So folks, feel free to come off mute and respond to James, though he's giving.
Yes, that does work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. So we are right on time. I would like to officially close the session, and then we can stay for a few more minutes if it's okay with James for Q&A. Thank you, James, again for our amazing session. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I'm pretty sure rest of the folks also did. And feel free, folks, to sign up for our next session from Loud and Agile at Work, which will be on June 8th at 7 p.m. The topic is Achieve Goal Across Your Organization with Portfolio Kanban System. And Dimitri Panorarev is going to present that session. So with that, we will stop recording, and feel free to have a few more questions fielded to James.